This is the GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 363, entitled Defemming the Workplace. Description. This flyer suggests how men can get feminazi women out of their hair at their workplace. Millions of men are now living the MGTOW or MGTOW monk lifestyle, removing women from their personal lives, but are forced to accept women's feminazi monoconscious bitchery at their workplace. This is intolerable for such MGTOWs and masculists. Things have to change. This flyer suggests how. The flyer itself. Defemming the Workplace by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. To defem the workplace means to get women out of men's hair in the workplace. For example, by allowing men to move their desks, or by placing men in their own rooms at company offices, etc., so that men don't have to suffer women's presence. For example, being forced to listen to women's endless, inane prattle, to their feminazi bitchery, or be forced to see their disgusting obesity, etc. Men have sought the peace and quiet of men-only spaces for as long as there have been two sexes. For example, the long houses of New Guinea, the gentlemen's clubs of Victorian England, etc. Men have always felt women were an alien species that men were forced to put up with due to women's two traditional monopolies, namely their vaginas and wombs. Men have been forced to be nice to women in order to be able to be allowed by women, who have always had a monopoly over reproduction, to penis women. And men have had to tolerate women because women created the next generation by growing and raising babies and children. But men despise women's nagging, women's controlling, their emotionality, their awful irrationality, their hysterics. Men have sought the peace and quiet of men-only spaces for thousands of generations. Once men invented the contraceptive pill, women have been able to reliably control the number of kids they want, namely 0, 1 or 2 in most cases. So have some half a century of career window, given that men have now given them modern medicine and a life expectancy now well into their 80s. The pill was invented in the early 60s, so women discovered they had time in their hands, so streamed into the workforce, adopting the traditional role of the male, that is, of the careerist. Of course, these newly careering women wanted the same rights as men to enter careers, the professions, etc., and push for equal access to institutions that were formerly for men only. The gender pendulum swung heavily in favour of women, given that half of humanity, that is women, collectively pushed for a change in the gender laws to promote women's careering. Now, half a century later, we now live in the masculist era, in which men are expressing their frustration and anger that the feminist pendulum has swung too far, so that men are feeling invaded by femalians who disturb men greatly, increasing men's stress and frustration levels greatly, to the point that men are now slamming their masculist fist onto the table, saying, "Enough is enough." There are now millions of men in Western countries, plus Korea and Japan, who have wiped their hands of women, living the MGTOW or the MGTOW monk lifestyle, preferring not to marry, not to have kids, and to spend their money on themselves. Many MGTOWs are so fed up with the very psychology of women that they are not only MGTOW with respect to marriage and paternity, but with respect to sex as well. That is, preferring to remain sexless, having absolutely nothing to do with women. There are millions of such men nowadays, with ever-growing numbers, as MGTOW and masculist ideas continue to spread across the world, thanks to the existence of the internet, which empowers individual men to make their videos and write their essays that influence men's thinking across the planet. Young men in particular are now very conscious that it's stupid and ignorant to marry and have kids in a historical era in which the hated fluffy feminists, in all their hypocrisy, have taken over the divorce courts and made divorce so toxic for men that in many Western countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity and live as MGTOWs, millions and millions of them. More millions of men are disgusted by the obesity of women. 40% of women in Western countries are now obese with a BMI, that's body mass index, over 30, with another 30% who are fat with a BMI between 25 and 30. Only a quarter of women are healthily slim with a BMI in the range of 18 to 25. Hence, millions of men are noticing that 3/4 of women today are unfuckable, veritable cockshrinkers. Since the main attraction of women to men is women's sexuality, women's vaginas, women's growing obesity makes it much easier for men to wipe their hands of women, consciously choosing to live the lifestyle of the MGTOW monk, choosing to have nothing to do with women in their personal lives. But there remains a very big problem for such men who want to remove the presence of women in their lives, and that is the presence of women in their workplace. This masculist flyer is addressed to this huge problem and makes suggestions on what men can do to overcome it. Typically, men work for 8 hours a day, that is half their daily waking time. So if millions of men choose to live the lifestyle of MGTOWs or MGTOW monks, then being forced to work together with women for, in capital letters, half of their daily waking hours is torture indeed. So, what can these men do to remove women from their workplaces? I am not suggesting that women be sent back to the kitchen, that is, to become fluffies again, as women were in the 50s and 60s, since the fipping of women is one of the major political platforms of the masculists. Masculists demand that women fip up and punish women who don't, who choose to become fluffies, choosing to parasite off the money and labour of a man, by totally ignoring fluffies, not even pumping and dumping them, so that these fluffy parasites, these fluffy man-slaving vermin, have their fluffy parasite genes removed from the gene pool, that is effectively wiping them out. So, if masculists and MGTOWs want women to be fips and not to have women in their hair at the workplace, bringing their female traits with them, causing mass misery to men in the workplace, how can this quandary be overcome? Because it sounds so contradictory. There are many things that masculists and MGTOWs can do. The first is to educate society that there are masculist and MGTOW movements, that gender oppression is not a one-way street, that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women's oppression is so sustained, lasting decades, as fluffy parasites live off men's money for decades, manslaving men for decades. Masculists and MGTOWs need to learn to harangue feminazi bitches out of the room if the feminazis think that they have the right to be feminazi bitchy to men in the workplace, because these feminazis are under the delusion that gender oppression is a one-way street. Angry masculists need to tell these monoconscious feminazi bigots that women are the main oppressors, and that men are waking up in their billions, not tolerating that women remain fluffy parasites on men. Company bosses also need to be taught that if they tolerate feminazi bitchery in their company, then that tolerance may cost them their company, as their best male employees explode and quit, taking their superior talent to rival companies. Company bosses, mostly men, need to have their masculist and MGTOW consciousnesses raised so that they can have an intuitive understanding of why their often best male employees are complaining so bitterly about feminazi bitchery in their workplaces. Company bosses need to be made painfully aware that if they don't become bi-conscious, that is, be as aware of how women oppress men as vice versa, then the verbal and ideological battle between the monoconscious feminazi bigots on the one hand and the MGTOWs and masculists on the other has the potential to destroy the company. So when male employees complain to the company bosses, to the CEOs, that there is way too high a level of feminazi bitchery in the company, then the CEO needs to talk to his employees, telling the feminazis that they have no right to be monoconscious bigots, telling their masculist ideas that women oppress men, and that feminazi offenders risk getting fired if they continue trashing men in the workplace. Masculists and MGTOWs also need to influence the thinking of male cops, since the ultimate backup of the law is male force, executed by male cops. If male cops are as monoconscious as feminazis, then these male cops will behave prejudiciously towards men. When the feminazis complain to the cops about the complaints of the masculists towards the feminazis in the workplace. Once male cops are as well informed about female gender oppression against men as vice versa, then the feminazis cannot depend on male cops always taking the female side, as cops do today, since many of these male cops will already have been made victims of the hated feminazi bigots in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts. One married cop with kids in 4 has had his life ruined in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court system. Assume then that the above level of education at company level and societal level in terms of masculists and MGTOW ideas has taken place, so that masculists and MGTOWs at work have the confidence to take the next step, that is, concrete measures to get women out of their hair at the workplace. Common sense says that women and men need to work together to get things done. Of course, there needs to be some level of interaction between the sexes for pragmatic reasons. What the MGTOWs and masculists are aiming to avoid is the groupthink of women in groups or even individual women who bring their monoconscious feminazi attitudes with them to work and then dump on men at the workplace. Such women will have their fucking heads bitten off as more and more men become masculists and MGTOWs, not tolerating such feminazi bigotry. Company bosses need to learn to accept the right of men, that is, half the population, to choose where they want to work. If these men are fed up with the prattle of women a few meters from their desks in the workplace, then these men should be given the right to move their desks away from women, or better still, to work in men-only rooms and only interact with women in meeting rooms expressly for that purpose. Then, if certain women are known to be monoconscious feminazi bitchy, then men will be in a position to interact with such women for purposes of getting the job done, behaving towards them in a neutral manner, getting the work done, then escaping back to their male safe house, back to calm, to peace of mind, free from the bother of having to deal with feminazi bitches for most of their working day. Those women who have taught themselves to be bi-conscious, who have bothered to learn masculist ideas, who see men as human beings to be respected, who are the superior sex, who invent everything, build everything, create everything, who have 10% larger brains, who have won 99% of science Nobel Prizes, who achieve far more than women, then such women will not need to be segregated from men. Men will know that some of their female colleagues are not feminazi bitches, but that situation is far from being the case today. In today's world, nearly all women are monoconscious and are feminazi bitches towards men in the workplace. So men need to put their foot down in the workplace, teaching these feminazi bitches that men will not tolerate being treated as second-class citizens, to be abused by feminazi bitches. Men are half the population and have rights who should be respected. Masculists and MGTOWs need to educate society so that society becomes bi-conscious and then needs to reform the workplace so that men have the right to men-only spaces, protected from the feminazi bitchery of feminazis. It's not acceptable that masculists and MGTOWs are forced to live a life of misery at the hands of feminazi witches for 8 hours a day in the workplace. Once the numbers of men who live in the masculist and MGTOW lifestyles grows large, then it's only a question of time before those men reform the workplace so that it becomes much calmer and much less stressful for men. The current workplace is a hellhole for men, made that way by feminazi bitches who need to be masculisted, that is, made to become bi-conscious in their gender political attitudes. If that does not happen, then many companies will be torn apart by a gender war between feminazi female employees and an angry, vengeful, masculist male employees. CEOs need to become very conscious of this threat to the very survival of their companies, because we are talking here about powerful emotional forces. Masculism is on the rise, and men are becoming very, very angry, no longer putting up with the monoconscious bigotry of feminazi witches who are so hated by men that millions of men choose to live womanless lives but are forced to work with women for half of their waking hours. This cannot continue. There will be an explosion. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 350 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.